go.
So in what way do you think the wide range of cultures and nationalities contribute to Melbourne?
Well, I think there is a wide range of cultures and nationalities here. I mentioned before that Melbourne was regarded as the third biggest Greek city in the world, but the Greeks aren't the only migrants that have come here. So that one of the things I've noticed in my lifetime is when I was younger, if you want to go out to a restaurant, it was basically English food, bangers and mash or steak and potatoes and stuff like that. And the variety now in restaurant life is fantastic because of all of the Asian, African, South American, as well as the European influence. Melbourne's regarded as the best city in the world for getting a cup of coffee, which is obviously the Italians here make coffee better than they do in Italy. Culturally, I think the different nationalities have contributed to that as well. And of course, Melbourne's the mecca for a lot of major sporting events, so people from all over the world come to that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think is the most influential foreign culture and why?
Oh, that's very hard. I mean, I suppose you'd say the old English culture and Irish culture is sort of probably the dominant stock on which the city was built, and that's where probably a lot of the old money is. But there's no doubt that the post-war migration of Italians, Greeks, and later from people from Yugoslavia had an enormous influence on the culture of the place and restaurant life and all those sorts of things, sporting life. And what's been the great change in the last 30, 40 years was largely the Vietnamese, mainly the Vietnamese, and to a lesser extent Cambodians, Laotians who came here. So there are parts of Melbourne now where you'd actually think you're in Hanoi or in Saigon. And I think most people would say that's immeasurably enriched the city. It's a much more interesting place to be than it was 50 years ago.
What do you think Melbourne's different cultures, how do you think Melbourne's different cultures have grown and bloomed over the years that you've been staying there?
I'll probably almost answer that. I find it a bit hard to answer the question, but because each of those cultures are very well represented here, I mean, then I think they've all had a big impact. I mean, it wasn't like 100 people from Vietnam settled in Melbourne. There are hundreds of thousands of people did, so it's actually a pretty visible part of the Vietnamese restaurants, for example, a very visible part of the landscape. So, as with all multicultural cities, probably there have been some hiccups along the way, and I think most people who've been migrants would say that they were treated poorly when they arrived by a lot of people, you know, the wogs and dagos and all that sort of stuff. But I think the second generation settles in pretty easily with most of them. One of the ironies I've discovered when I talk to taxi drivers is often the latest lot of immigrants don't like another lot to come. You know, they sort of almost, once I've arrived here, I like to close the door. So, but no, I think whichever way you look at it, Melbourne's a better place because of the migration.
Yeah. Do you think Melbourne is as culturally aware as it could be?
Probably not. I mean, I think with most, depends a bit on how you define culture. How would you like me to define culture for the purposes of the question?
Well, culture being...
And stuff.
Pardon?
Yeah.
Like along the lines of race and...
More that rather than
yeah.
culture in a sort of an aesthetic sense. So what was the question again?
Do you think Melbourne could be as culturally aware as it could be?
I'm sure it isn't, but I think on world standards they don't do a bad job here. I mean, we have very little community violence and overt racism. I'm absolutely sure there is racism, for example, but it's probably a more subtle form of racism. I think that's a work in progress. And one of the things that I think the AFL is, and the NRL in Sydney, I think what the sporting codes have done has been leaders in helping to make the rougher edges of community understand that cultural diversity is really important and should be respected.
Yeah. Do you think the locals are very accepting and welcoming of those cultures?
Again, I think on worldwide standards, the answer is yes. On what we should be, the answer is probably no. I mean, I get frustrated at times when I see, say, obviously Chinese visitors or Japanese visitors with a city where there's absolutely no signs that can help them,
Yeah.
trying to ask someone or having trouble and they're given the complete brush off by some ignorant Australian who, when he goes overseas, expects everybody to speak English. So I don't think we probably, but I think if I think of almost every other country in the world where racism's actually, even in Asia and Africa, where if you're not my mob, you know, you're not trusted. I think we, in general, Australia does those sort of things better. And one of the things I think actually, I talked to you guys before about football. Football in Melbourne is a much more integrating sport than it is in any other part of Australia. New South Wales and Queensland particularly. And so, for example, we had a British politician out a couple of years ago, and I remember that person saying that one of the differences between Melbourne and Sydney was when the kids go to the mosque in Melbourne, they're likely to be wearing their football jumpers, and they're less likely to be doing that in Sydney. I think that some of those community divisions are more pronounced in Sydney than they are here. So, for example, you had race riots at Cronulla and the Canberra and that in Sydney, which we haven't had here. That's not to say we're not. There's a nasty thing going on in a country town called Bendigo at the moment, where there's the Muslim community wanting to build a mosque, and there's very noisy and loud and unpleasant opposition to that.
Yeah.
What's also clear is that some of that opposition is rent-a-crowd, people who are coming in from outside to sort of try to stir up problems. But the fact that even has a life and gets oxygen there is an area where it just goes to show we're not where we need to be.
Do you think Melbourne is a world leader when it comes to culture and nationality?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's not like New York. I just come back from New York, and New York's this incredible melting pot. But just about everybody who lives in New York, in Manhattan, is only there temporarily. You know, they're on the way to either the suburbs of Connecticut or off somewhere else. I mean, people who come to Melbourne are here to stay and live here tonight. I think Melbourne does all that stuff pretty well, but I think what's changed in the last 30 or 40 years is 30 or 40 years ago you could be rude to a migrant and people sort of wouldn't do anything. Now the stakes are much higher. And I don't know whether you read about the Adam Goods getting booed by football crowds, which was terrible. The one crowd he didn't get booed by the way, was at Geelong when he came back. And we worked hard on our crowd. There's always some idiots there, but I think deep down in the community everywhere, there's a lot of people who are much more ready to be incited to violent reactions now than would have been in the past, and I think that's a big shame.
Do you think Melbourne sets itself apart from other cities in this area?
No, I wouldn't say it sets itself off. No, there's a usual rivalry. I mean, Melbourne would characterise itself as more sophisticated and less obsessed by money than Sydney. Now, Sydney would no doubt turn up their nose and sort of think that we're a bunch of flakes down here. So there's a bit of a cultural difference. We would regard, for example, the corruption that's been evident in New South Wales and Queensland over the journey, you know, the police force and politicians, has never been that bad. I'm not saying it doesn't exist in Melbourne, but I think Melbourne's origins are going back to not even being a convict colony and stuff like that, is still a bit in the gene pool, and we while nobody would be silly enough to say that Melbourne's power structures aren't capable of corruption, there's no evidence that they've been as bad as how rotten. I mean, there are a whole bunch of New South Wales and Queensland premiers who were, in the last 30 or 40 years, who are regarded as completely corrupt. That hasn't been the case here, and I think that sort of stems from some aspects of the culture which values some things a bit differently. I don't want to make too much of that, but there's a bit of something there, I think.
Yeah. Do you think that Melbourne has enough events and festivals going around to support the wide range of cultures here?
Yeah, we'd like to get a few more.
Yeah.
Melbourne does all that stuff really well. What it may not do as well, I mean, it does the mega events really well. Like it's got, you know, the Melbourne Cup and the motorbike Grand Prix and the Australian Open, which is a Grand Slam event, and all that stuff, does all that stuff really well. Whether it does the next level down, you know, the community festivals as well as anybody else, I've got no idea. Probably not, but mostly it does that stuff as well as anybody, I suspect.
Yeah. So, how often are you involved with cultural events through your work and your spare time?
Well, again, it depends on what you mean by cultural events, but if you define culture before as sort of issues of race and diversity and multicultural stuff, it rears its head a lot. I mean, for example, the football community and the football club I'm in charge of is very committed to notions of diversity. The church I go to is very committed to notions of diversity, and those would be two institutions which are very different in some respects, but which both of them actually talk about how respecting differences, whether they're sexuality, religion, ethnic background, whatever, respecting and accepting those differences is really important. So I think there are a lot of institutions down here that are aware of it and try to do the right thing. Whether how deep that goes into the community, of course, is another matter.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Colin.
Pleasure. Nice to see you.